She was a gospel star until silence became her only song.
The audio pages presents The Song Beneath the Waves, a broken voice, a hidden faith, and the whisper that changed everything. Written by Henrietta. Chapter 1. The Voice That Died. The spotlight burned bright on Julia Lucas. Her golden gown shimmered beneath the stage lights as if heaven itself had wrapped her in glory. Thousands of voices rose in unison, hands lifted high, tears streaming, hearts surrendered. She sang with power and purity, the kind of voice that didn't just echo in a room, but seemed to stir the air, to reach the edges of heaven. Grace will find me where the night hides its stars. Grace will hold me when I fall apart. It was her signature song, written by her fiancé, Pastor Henry Cole, a man whose gentle eyes and steady faith had grounded her meteoric rise. Together, they had become the face of faith for millions. He preached, she sang. They told stories of hope, of forgiveness, of a God who mended what the world shattered. But that night, beneath the dazzling lights and roaring applause, something inside Julia trembled. A strange heaviness pressed against her chest. Not exhaustion, but something deeper, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. She pushed it away. The crowd wanted one more song. Her band waited for her cue. She smiled, lifted the microphone, and sang again. Her voice soared, but for the first time in years, it felt hollow. When the curtain finally fell and the cheers faded, she stood backstage with her palms pressed against her face. Her whole body shook with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. Henry was waiting for her with that quiet, knowing smile, the one that always reached his eyes before it reached his lips. "You were amazing, Jules," he said, wrapping her in a hug. "You always are." She rested her head against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of rain and cologne. "I don't know," she murmured. "It felt different tonight." He pulled back slightly, studying her. "Different how?" She hesitated. "Like I was singing the words but not feeling them. Like the song belonged to someone else." Henry's eyes softened. "Maybe you're just tired. You've been touring for weeks." "Maybe," she said, but deep down she knew it wasn't just fatigue. Something in her spirit had gone quiet, and she couldn't explain why. The rain started as they drove home, gentle at first, then furious, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. Julia leaned her head against the window, watching droplets race down the glass. The radio hummed softly, playing old hymns. Henry drove with one hand on the wheel, the other holding hers. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "When this tour ends, maybe we take a break, just us, somewhere quiet." Julia smiled faintly. "I mean, away from microphones and interviews?" "Exactly. Just you, me, and the sound of waves. No pressure, no expectations." "That sounds perfect," she whispered. And it did. For the first time that night, peace brushed against her heart. Then, headlights. A sudden glare from the opposite lane. A blinding flash. The world shattered into screams and glass. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was Henry shouting her name and the sound of metal folding like paper.
When Julia opened her eyes, everything was white. The ceiling, the walls, the sheets tucked around her body. Even the air felt pale, thick with antiseptic and sorrow. Pain bloomed at the back of her head. She tried to move, but her body protested, and then she remembered. The rain, the light. Henry. "Henry?" Her voice cracked, hoarse, barely audible. A nurse appeared, her face kind but tense. "You're awake," she said gently. "Please don't try to talk. you've been through a lot." Julia's heart pounded. "Where is he?" she forced out. The nurse hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and that pause said everything. "No, no, no!" The sound that came from her wasn't even human, a mixture of a sob and a scream that tore through the sterile room and shattered the quiet. Nurses rushed in. Someone held her shoulders down. Machines beeped frantically. And somewhere in the chaos, her voice broke completely. Days blurred into each other. Funeral arrangements were made. Faces came and went. Friends, family, reporters, well-wishers. Julia didn't remember most of them. She sat in silence through the service, her body present but her soul somewhere far away. When it came time to sing at Henry's memorial, his favorite hymn, "All is Grace," Julia stood, opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Not a sound. Her throat burned, her voice caught, and silence fell heavy in the hall. The microphone slipped from her hand, and she walked off the stage without a word. Weeks passed, then months. Julia vanished from the public eye. Her management team released a statement. Julia Lucas will be taking an indefinite hiatus to focus on recovery. But recovery never came. She sold her home, packed away her awards, and stopped answering calls. Her voice, once her ministry, her weapon, her gift, had abandoned her, and in her mind she believed it was divine punishment. She replayed the accident 1,000 times. If she hadn't been tired, if she had insisted they wait out the storm, if she hadn't needed the applause so badly, maybe Henry would still be alive. The thought festered like an open wound. And God? God was silent. She prayed, or tried to, but her words felt like stones sinking into a bottomless well. "Where were you?" she whispered one night, kneeling by her window as rain tapped softly against the glass. "Why did you let me live and not him?" The only answer was the echo of her own heartbeat. One morning she stood in her apartment surrounded by boxes. Everything felt foreign. The framed posters, the awards on the shelf, the piano in the corner gathering dust. The world that had once been her kingdom now felt like a cage. She picked up a letter, one Henry had written to her during their engagement. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still strong, steady, full of the faith she'd loved him for. "If ever life breaks us, Jules, remember, grace doesn't stop when we fall. It finds us there." Her hands trembled. She folded the letter carefully, pressed it against her chest, and whispered, "Then find me, Grace, because I don't know where I am anymore." That afternoon, she called her driver and asked him to take her to her car. She wanted to drive herself to somewhere, anywhere, far from the memories. The only destination that came to mind was a name she'd once heard Henry mention, Eden's Reach. He had wanted to build a retreat there for weary pastors, a place for rest and renewal. Maybe that's where she needed to go. The road stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of gray cutting through hills and trees and fog. She drove in silence, her reflection flickering faintly in the windshield. The world outside looked blurred, like a painting smudged by tears. Every now and then she whispered into the quiet, "Are you still there?" But the silence was heavy, so heavy she could almost hear it. As dusk settled, rain began to fall again, slow, deliberate drops tapping on the windshield. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The rhythm of the wipers filled the car like a heartbeat.
For hours she drove, lost in thought. Memories swirled in her mind. Henry's laughter, his sermons, their plans for the future. His voice lingered, calm, warm, unshakable. "The test of faith isn't when you can sing, Jules," he used to say. "It's when you can't." Her eyes burned. "You were wrong," she whispered. "I can't do this without you." The rain intensified, drumming harder. She switched on the radio to drown out her thoughts. Static. She changed the station. More static. She sighed and turned it off again. The silence returned, thicker now, almost suffocating. Then it happened. Without warning, the radio flickered back on. She froze. Her hands tightened on the wheel. The car's electrical system hadn't worked since the storm began. She hadn't even touched the controls. But the radio screen glowed softly, humming to life. Then a melody filled the car. Soft, familiar, haunting. Her breath caught in her throat. It was his song, Henry's song, the one he'd been working on before he died, the one she'd never heard finished, the one he'd promised to surprise her with at their wedding. "If I should leave before the morning breaks, remember love doesn't die, it only waits." Julia's chest constricted, tears blurred her vision. Her trembling hand reached toward the dial, but she couldn't turn it off. Every note felt alive, whispering through the air like a heartbeat returning from the grave. The car seemed to pulse with light for a moment, or maybe it was just the lightning flashing across the horizon. She slowed the vehicle, pulling to the side of the road. The rain poured harder, streaking across the windshield like liquid fire. She stared at the radio screen. There was no signal, no station name, just a faint glowing word. Grace. Her heart pounded. "No," she whispered. "No, no." But the song continued, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The screen went dark. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, tears streaming down her face. The air inside the car felt charged, alive, as if the world had just inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Finally, she whispered into the stillness, "Henry?" Only the rain replied. She closed her eyes, her body trembling. Somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. A spark she couldn't name. Fear. Hope. Maybe both. After a while, she started the car again and drove on. Into the storm. Towards a place called Eden's Reach. She didn't know what awaited her there. She only knew that the silence had finally spoken.
Chapter 2. The Town of Quiet Waters. The road to Eden's Reach wound like a silver ribbon through mist and silence. Julia drove until the city lights faded into memory and the world softened into gray and blue. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the scent of it lingered, fresh, clean, alive. Ahead, the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon. The sun rose like a hesitant promise, casting light over the sleepy seaside town. A wooden sign greeted her at the entrance, "Welcome to Eden's Reach, a place for rest." She almost laughed at the irony. Rest was the last thing her soul knew how to do. The town was small, barely a cluster of cottages and cobbled streets hugging the curve of the shoreline. The ocean stretched beyond it, endless and calm, whispering softly against the rocks. She could hear it even with her windows rolled up, that steady, rhythmic breathing that felt older than time. Julia parked near a small inn to ask for directions to a rental cottage she'd found through an old listing. The air outside was cool and salted, brushing her skin with the gentlest touch. For the first time in months, she inhaled deeply, and it didn't hurt. The inn smelled faintly of wood polish and lavender. A bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. Behind the counter, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair looked up from her ledger. "Well, good morning, dear," the woman said warmly. "You must be our new arrival. Julia Lucas, isn't it?" Julia blinked. "How did you—" The woman smiled. "Small town. We don't get many strangers anymore. I'm Martha, by the way. I take care of the inn, and I handle most of the rentals around here, too." "Oh," Julia said softly. "Yes, I called about the seaside cottage." "Right," Martha said, flipping through a folder. "That one's a little ways past the dunes. It's quiet, peaceful, though some say too quiet for their liking." She paused, her eyes narrowing playfully. "You don't mind a bit of solitude, do you?" "No," Julia murmured. "I prefer it." Martha's smile softened. "Then you'll do fine here." She handed Julia a small brass key attached to a seashell-shaped tag. "It's old, but it's homey. The view of the water is worth every creak in the floorboards. You'll find a little grocer down the lane, and if you ever need company, the cafe across the square serves the best tea you'll ever taste." "Thank you," Julia said, managing a faint smile. "I think I'll be fine." As she turned to leave, Martha added gently, "If you hear singing at night, don't be alarmed. The sea carries strange sounds. Sometimes it's just the wind through the cliffs." Julia paused, frowning slightly. "Singing?" Martha shrugged. "Old stories, that's all. People say the abandoned chapel still remembers the hymns it once held." Julia's breath caught, but she forced a nod. "I'll keep that in mind." The cottage sat perched on a small rise overlooking the ocean. White paint peeled gently from its wooden walls, and ivy climbed up one side, framing the windows like green lace. It looked lonely, but not abandoned, as if it had been waiting for someone. Inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and old wood. There was a fireplace in the corner, a faded rug, and a single rocking chair that creaked when she brushed against it. Through the window, the sea stretched endlessly, its rhythm steady and soothing. Julia dropped her bag near the door and stood silently, taking it all in. The sound of waves filled the room, mingling with the distant cry of gulls. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel trapped. She made tea, weak, watery, and carried it outside to the porch. The ocean glimmered under the afternoon sun, gold and blue melting together. She wrapped her hands around the cup and let the breeze tangle her hair. Maybe this was what Henry had wanted for them, a quiet place, away from the noise. Maybe grace could still be found here. But even as she thought it, a pang of guilt twisted inside her. What right did she have to feel peace when he lay beneath the earth? She closed her eyes and whispered, "I don't know how to start over." The waves answered softly, "Shh, shh," like the hush of a comforting voice. The first few days in Eden's Reach passed in a strange rhythm. Julia rose early, walked along the shoreline, and returned to her cottage before dusk. She spoke to no one except the grocer and Martha. The town folk smiled politely, but kept their distance, the way small towns do with strangers carrying invisible weights. It was on the fourth evening that she saw it, the chapel. She'd wandered farther along the cliffs than usual, following a narrow trail between tall grasses. The sun was setting, washing the world in amber light. Then she saw the silhouette, a small stone building with a crooked cross on its roof. Grace Chapel read the faded sign by the gate. The wooden doors were locked, but the windows were broken, the glass long gone. Ivy had claimed the walls, and a few seagulls perched on the roof. Yet even in decay, it felt holy, the kind of place where prayers lingered long after words were gone. She walked closer, her footsteps crunching softly on gravel. A sense of sorrow hung in the air, not frightening, but heavy, like the weight of unspoken confessions. Peering through a broken window, Julia saw wooden pews coated in dust. An old piano stood near the altar, its keys yellowed and broken. Sunlight filtered through a crack in the roof, illuminating the space in golden stripes. For a long moment, she just stood there, unable to look away. And then, something shifted inside her. It wasn't music, exactly, more like a memory of it, a sound she felt rather than heard. The air seemed to hum. Julia blinked, shaken. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "It's just the wind." But she couldn't shake the chill running through her. She turned and walked quickly back toward the cottage, trying not to look over her shoulder. That night, the ocean sang louder. Julia sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. The room was dim except for the flicker of light dancing on the walls. Outside, waves crashed in slow, steady rhythm, and the wind sighed through the cracks of the old windows. She tried reading, but every few minutes her eyes drifted to the window. The chapel was not visible from her porch, but she could feel it somewhere beyond the curve of the cliffs. She set the book aside and closed her eyes. For a moment, she almost felt calm, until a sound drifted through the night, faint, melodic, familiar. Her eyes snapped open. It was a hymn, soft, distant, but indiscoverably a hymn. She held her breath, straining to listen. The notes floated on the wind, mournful, tender, beautiful. She recognized the melody instantly. It was Henry's song, the same song that had played on her car radio that night. Her pulse quickened. "No," she whispered, "not again." She stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and stepped toward the door. The night air rushed in, cool and damp, carrying the faint echo of the tune. It was coming from the direction of the chapel. The world outside was still. The moon hung low, casting pale light across the sand. Julia walked down the narrow path toward the cliffs, her heart thudding with every step. The closer she got, the clearer the sound became. The words, Henry's words, reached her through the night air. "Grace will find you where the night hides its stars." Her hands trembled. Tears burned behind her eyes. "Henry?" she called softly. The wind swallowed her voice. "Is someone there?" The hymn continued, rising and falling with the tide. It sounded both near and impossibly far away. She reached the chapel gate. It hung loosely on rusted hinges, creaking as she pushed it open. The courtyard was empty, bathed in moonlight. The door was still locked. Through the broken window, shadows danced on the walls, flickers of movement that might have been candlelight. Her breath came in short bursts. She took one hesitant step closer. "Hello?" Silence. Then, a final note, soft and low, fading into nothing. The air stilled. She waited, listening, but the sound did not return. The chapel stood quiet and lifeless, just as it had before. Her rational mind told her it was the wind, the sea, a trick of memory and grief. But something deeper whispered otherwise. She lingered there a long time, unable to move. Finally she turned and walked back toward her cottage, the night pressing close around her. When she reached her porch, she glanced back one last time. The chapel was barely visible in the distance, just a dark outline against the pale sky. And yet, for a heartbeat, she thought she saw a flicker of light in one of its broken windows, a single candle.
Then it vanished. Julia didn't sleep that night. She sat in the rocking chair by the window, watching the sea glimmer faintly under the moonlight. Every so often, she thought she heard something, the faintest trace of melody in the wind, but she couldn't be sure.
Her mind replayed the sound of the hymn again and again. Had someone been in the chapel? A traveler? A local? Or something else? Something not meant to be explained. She pressed her palms together and whispered, "If this is you, God, why now?" No answer came, only the sound of the waves, endless and eternal. She sighed, leaned her head back, and closed her eyes. The exhaustion of grief pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. And yet beneath that heaviness, something new stirred, faint, fragile, but real. A flicker of curiosity, a tremor of hope. When dawn finally came, Julia stepped outside. The sea stretched before her, vast and shimmering. Gulls circled lazily in the pale sky. The world felt washed clean as if the night had never happened. She made her way to the beach, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and renewal. She walked until she stood where the waves kissed the shore. The water lapped gently at her toes. For the first time in months, she whispered a prayer, hesitant, almost accidental. Whatever that was, don't let me be afraid of it. The wind lifted her hair and carried her words out over the water. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of the sea surround her. Behind her, far across the cliffs, the chapel stood silent, its broken windows glinting in the sunlight. But if she'd stayed a moment longer, she might have seen it. A curtain fluttering softly inside, though no breeze touched the walls. And somewhere, faint but unmistakable, the echo of a single piano key rang out, a sound swallowed quickly by the roar of the sea.
Chapter 3. The Fisherman's Secret. The ocean was still half asleep when Julia stepped out onto the sand that morning. The horizon shimmered with the faintest hint of light, as if dawn itself were deciding whether to arrive or stay hidden behind the veil of mist. The tide whispered softly at her feet, its rhythm steady and timeless. She had woken before sunrise again, not because she wanted to, but because she hadn't truly slept. The memory of the hymn from the chapel lingered in her dreams, blending with Henry's voice and the roar of the crash that had ended everything. No matter how she tried to reason it away, she couldn't shake the conviction that someone or something had been inside that chapel. Still, she needed air, water, quiet. She needed to feel alive again. So she had come to the shore and rented a small wooden sailboat from an old dock near her cottage. The attendant, half awake and friendly, had assured her that the water was calm this time of day. "Just stay close to shore," he said. She'd promised she would. Now, as the little boat glided over the glassy water, Julia tilted her face toward the rising sun. The golden light brushed her skin, warm and delicate, and for a moment she let herself imagine she was someone else, a woman without ghosts, sailing toward peace. The wind tugged softly at her hair, carrying the scent of salt and morning. She smiled faintly, feeling the ache inside her chest ease just a little. For the first time in months, she hummed. Not a song, just a fragile thread of sound. It cracked halfway through, her throat still stiff from the injury that had taken her voice. The sound made her heart twist. She stopped, staring at the horizon. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. "Maybe someday." The boat rocked gently. The sea stretched endlessly, beautiful and merciless. Lost in thought, she didn't notice how far she drifted until the shoreline began to blur. The wind had shifted, subtle but insistent, pulling her farther from land. She tried to turn the sail, but her fingers fumbled with the rope. The tide caught her, tugging the little boat sideways. The waves began to swell, growing restless. "Wait!" she gasped, pulling harder. The rope burned against her palms. The horizon tilted. Panic surged through her chest. The coast, her cottage, the familiar cliffs, was now a distant shadow. "God!" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please!" And then, as if in answer, a voice shouted from somewhere behind her. "Hold on!" She spun toward the sound. Another boat was approaching, larger and sturdier, cutting through the water with practiced grace. A man stood at the helm, tall and broad-shouldered, a lantern swinging from the bow. He steered closer, his movements swift but calm. "Your sail's caught in the current. Let it go before it flips you." Julia froze, then obeyed, releasing the rope. The sail dropped slackly. The boat steadied. A moment later his vessel came alongside hers. He leaned over, reaching out a weathered hand. "Come on, you'll be safer here." She hesitated, heart pounding, then took his hand. His grip was strong, steady, sure. In one motion he helped her climb aboard. "Thank you," she managed, breathless. He nodded once, eyes scanning the waves. "You're lucky. The tide turns fast here. Another few minutes and the current would have carried you past the reefs." Julia looked down at the water, realizing how easily she could have been lost. The thought made her shiver. The man untied her small boat and began guiding both vessels back toward shore. For a while, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of the sea and the creak of wood filled the silence. When they were near enough to see the coastline again, he finally said, "You're new here." She nodded. "Just arrived last week." He glanced at her, his eyes steady but unreadable. "Not many outsiders come to Eden's Reach these days." "I needed quiet. I thought the sea might help." At that his expression softened. It usually does. They reached the dock just as the sun climbed fully above the water. Julia stepped onto the wooden planks, her legs unsteady. "Thank you again," she said, brushing back her hair. He smiled faintly. "You're welcome. I'm Alexis." "Julia." "Julia," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "You might want to stay closer to shore next time. The sea can look gentle and still have a temper." "I noticed," she said, managing a small laugh. Alexis's smile deepened, not wide, but genuine. He had the look of someone shaped by the ocean. Strong arms, sun-worn skin, eyes the color of deep water. But there was something else, too, a quiet melancholy that shadowed his calm. "Do you fish for a living?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded. "My family has for generations. These waters feed us and remind us who we are." "That sounds grounding," she said. He looked out at the waves, his gaze distant. "It can be, if you learn to listen." She followed his gaze, curious. "Listen to what?" He smiled faintly. "The sea doesn't just speak through storms. Sometimes it sings." Something in the way he said it made her heartbeat quicken. "You've heard it too, haven't you?" He turned to her, puzzled. "Heard what?" "The hymn," she said quietly. "At night, from the old chapel." For the first time his expression changed. The calm faded, replaced by something unreadable. A flicker of alarm, quickly buried. "You must have imagined it," he said lightly, too quickly. "No one goes near that place anymore." "But I heard it," she insisted. "A voice, a song. My fiancé wrote it, before he—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Alexis looked at her for a long moment, then turned away. "Some songs never die, even when the singers do," he murmured. She frowned. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. Forget the chapel. Some things are better left quiet." Before she could ask more, he untied his boat and pushed off, the tide carrying him back toward open water. Julia stood on the dock long after he was gone, the wind tugging at her scarf. Something about his tone, not dismissive, but protective, stirred both unease and curiosity in her chest. He knew something, she was sure of it. Over the next week, Julia found herself noticing Alexis everywhere, hauling nets along the shore, mending his boat at the dock, walking the beach at dusk with a lantern in his hand. He always nodded politely when he saw her, but there was a distance in his manner, a wall she couldn't quite breach. Still, she felt drawn to him. His quiet steadiness reminded her of Henry in some ways, though Alexis carried a sorrow she didn't yet understand. Sometimes she caught him staring at the horizon for long stretches, his lips moving in silent prayer. Once she thought she saw tears in his eyes, but when she approached, he simply smiled and said, "The wind's strong today." It became a pattern. Each morning she walked the beach, and each morning she'd see him there. Sometimes he'd wave, sometimes he wouldn't. And every night the sea sang, faintly like a memory drifting just beyond reach. One evening Julia brought him a thermos of tea as he worked on his nets near the pier. "You shouldn't have," he said, surprised. "It's just tea," she replied, smiling. "A thank you for saving me." He hesitated, then accepted it. Then, "Thank you, Julia." They sat in companionable silence, watching the tide roll in. The air smelled of salt and twilight. "Why do you keep coming back to the sea?" he asked after a while. She looked at the horizon. "It's the only place that doesn't judge me." He studied her face quietly. "You carry loss." Her throat tightened. Everyone carries something. He nodded, eyes lowered. "That's true." When she dared to glance at him again, his expression was open, but his eyes, deep and shadowed, held a weight she couldn't name. She almost asked about it, almost said something, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said softly, "Tell me about the chapel." He froze. Then he looked out to the waves again and said, "Some places remember too much." "Remember what?" He didn't answer. He only stood, returning the empty thermos with a faint smile. "Good night, Julia." And just like that, he was gone again, his lantern swaying in the dark as he walked down the shore. That night, Julia couldn't shake the unease coiling in her chest. Every word Alexis had said replayed in her mind. Some songs never die. Some places remember too much. What did it mean? What was it he was hiding? By midnight, she was still awake. The waves murmured outside, calm and hypnotic. The moon hung high, draping the world in silver.
Then she saw it, a faint glow moving along the cliffs. A lantern. Her heart thudded. Alexis. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The sand was cold under her bare feet as she followed the moving light. The night was silent, except for the hush of the sea. The air smelled of salt and mystery. The lantern's glow moved steadily along the path that led to Grace Chapel. Her breath quickened. He's going there. Keeping her distance, she followed. The grass brushed against her legs, damp with dew. The wind carried the faintest hum, not a song this time, but a whisper of words she couldn't quite catch. When Alexis reached the chapel gate, he paused, looking around as if to make sure he was alone. Then he pushed the gate open and entered. Julia crept closer, stopping just short of the entrance. Through the broken window she could see him inside. He placed the lantern on the altar. Its light danced across the dusty walls. Then, to her astonishment, he knelt, his head bowed low, his shoulders trembling. His lips moved, praying. She strained to listen, pressing a hand to the wall. His voice was barely audible over the waves, but she caught fragments. "Forgive us. Still hear us. Please, not again." Her pulse hammered. He reached into his coat and took something out, a small, worn music box. He placed it on the altar and wound it once. The melody that played was faint, but unmistakable. Henry's hymn. Julia gasped softly, tears stinging her eyes. Alexis froze. He turned sharply toward the sound, eyes wide, scanning the darkness beyond the window. For a moment, they locked eyes. He looked stricken, as though caught in a secret he'd sworn to keep. Then, without a word, he blew out the lantern. The chapel plunged into darkness. Julia stumbled back, heart racing, as the door creaked open. But instead of pursuing her, he stopped on the threshold, a shadow against the moonlight. "Julia," his voice came softly, wary, "you shouldn't be here." She stepped back, trembling. "What is this, Alexis? That song, why do you have it? Why are you praying in that place?" He was silent for a long moment. The wind howled between them. Finally he said, "Because I made a promise, and promises have a way of haunting us." Then he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving her alone with the sea and the echo of that impossible melody. Julia stood there long after he was gone, staring at the dark outline of the chapel. The night felt alive, as if the very air breathed secrets. She wanted to run back to her cottage, to lock the doors and pretend none of it had happened. But something stronger kept her rooted in place, something between fear and faith. The wind picked up, carrying a single ghostly note across the water. The hymn. Again. This time she didn't flee. She stood still, listening as the sound swelled, soft and sorrowful, wrapping around her like a prayer too sacred to end. When it faded, she whispered, "Henry, what are you trying to tell me?" No answer came, only the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. By the time dawn broke, Julia sat on her porch, sleepless and hollow-eyed, watching the sky turn pink. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, Alexis would be preparing his boat for another day. She could almost picture him, quiet, burdened, carrying that secret like an anchor tied to his soul. She didn't know what promise he had made or how Henry's song had found its way to him, but she knew one thing now. The chapel was not abandoned, and whatever truth lay hidden within its walls was calling her closer.
Chapter 4. The Song in the Wind. The next morning dawned pale and fragile, as though the sun itself were reluctant to wake. The ocean murmured softly beneath a sky brushed with silver clouds. Julia stood at the window, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. The memory of last night clung to her like mist. The image of Alexis kneeling in the chapel, his whispered prayer, the sound of the hymn that should not have existed. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flicker of his lantern, heard the faint turn of the music box, and the haunting melody that had belonged to Henry, her Henry, playing again through another man's trembling hands. Now daylight spilled across the sea, and still her heart refused to quiet. "Some songs never die," Alexis had said. The words repeated themselves like a pulse. She turned from the window and set down her cup. Her gaze fell on the small cross necklace resting on the table, the one Henry had given her months before the accident. She hadn't worn it since. For a long time she stared at it. Then she whispered, "If this is you trying to reach me, I need to know." The ocean breeze brushed against the cottage walls, almost like an answer. That was enough. She took her coat, stepped outside, and followed the path toward Grace Chapel. It looked different in the sun. The chapel's stone walls gleamed faintly beneath the morning light, softened by ivy and years of salt air. The wildflowers that grew along its foundation swayed gently in the breeze. The once menacing structure seemed almost gentle now, tired but not cruel. Julia hesitated at the gate. The rusty hinges creaked as she pushed it open. The air inside the courtyard felt cooler, as if the shadows themselves carried whispers of the past. She paused on the threshold, listening. Only the gulls cried in the distance. Then she stepped inside. Dust floated in thin beams of light filtering through the broken roof. Wooden pews, warped and cracked, sat in crooked rows. A thick stillness filled the air. Not emptiness, but presence. The piano near the altar caught her attention first. It was smaller than she had expected. Its wood faded to gray, several keys missing entirely. But it was beautiful in its ruin. She brushed her fingers across the lid, leaving streaks in the dust. The instrument felt almost warm beneath her touch, as if it still remembered music. Her throat tightened. She hadn't touched a piano since the night of the concert, the night Henry had died. She closed her eyes and pressed a single key. The note that answered was low and hollow, trembling through the silence like a voice rising from sleep. Tears stung her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom she spoke. She wandered deeper into the chapel. Behind the altar, a faded curtain hung half-torn, concealing what looked like a small storage alcove. Curiosity tugged at her. She pulled it aside. The space beyond was narrow, lined with wooden shelves. Dusty hymn books lay stacked in uneven piles, their covers brittle and stained by years of moisture. Unlit candles stood beside them, melted into the shapes of forgotten prayers. A faint breeze moved through the cracks in the wall, stirring the curtain behind her. Julia crouched, running her fingers over the spines of the hymn books. Some of the titles were worn away, others barely legible. She opened one and found pages filled with notes, handwritten messages in the margins, prayers, dedications, small confessions. Her breath caught when she noticed the name written on one page, Henry. Her heart stilled. She blinked, reading again. The ink was faded but unmistakable. It couldn't be him. He'd never been here. And yet, the sound of the wind outside grew stronger, humming faintly through the broken windows. It almost sounded like music. "Henry?" she whispered. The wind answered, lifting a loose sheet of paper that fluttered across the floor and slid beneath the piano. Julia followed it. She knelt, reaching beneath the keys, and her fingers brushed against something smooth and firm, a sealed envelope. She pulled it out slowly, her hands trembling. It was coated in dust, the edges yellowed with age. On the front, her name was written in looping handwriting she knew by heart. Julia Lucas. Her breath hitched. Below it, in faded ink, a small postmark read, Eden's Reach, dated 8 years ago. She sank to her knees, the envelope clutched tightly in her shaking hands. It didn't make sense. She had never been to Eden's Reach before. Neither had Henry. Or had he? The chapel felt smaller now, the air thick, almost heavy. Julia stared at the letter, unable to move. 8 years ago, Henry would have been a theology student. They hadn't even met yet. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, the familiar slant of his handwriting. The sight of it filled her with an ache so deep it almost hurt to breathe. How could this be here? She rose unsteadily, sitting on the nearest pew. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the dust-smeared glass of the window beside her. Every instinct told her not to open it, that doing so might unravel something she wasn't ready to face. But she couldn't stop herself. With a trembling breath, she slid her thumb under the flap and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, carefully. She opened it, her heart pounding. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his. Her eyes blurred as she read the first line. My dearest Julia. Her vision swam. She pressed her hand to her mouth. If you are reading this, then grace has already brought you farther than you planned to go. I don't know when this letter will find you, only that it must. You once told me that silence was proof God had stopped listening, but I've learned the silence is often where he speaks the loudest. Her hands trembled. She could barely keep reading. Be still and know that I am God.
The words hit her like thunder. She remembered the night she had mocked that very verse. She could still hear herself saying it, laughing gently as she'd told Henry, "Stillness is just another word for doing nothing." He had only smiled then and said softly, "No, it's what comes before everything changes." Tears blurred the ink as she read the final lines. If grief ever steals your voice, remember, it was never the sound God loved. It was the faith behind it. Find the song in the wind, Julia. It will lead you home. Henry. The world tilted. The words swam on the page. Her breath came shallow, broken. "No," she whispered. How could this?" The letter slipped from her hands and drifted to the floor. She stumbled to her feet, clutching the edge of the pew to steady herself. The wind outside grew stronger, sweeping through the cracks, lifting the curtains like the breath of something unseen. It wasn't frightening. It was alive. The air itself seemed to hum, faintly at first, then louder. The sound, that melody, began again. Henry's hymn. It came from nowhere and everywhere. Soft, wordless, carried on the wind. The same tune that had played from the music box, the same that had haunted her dreams. But now, in the light of day, it didn't sound ghostly. It sounded full, gentle, like a promise. Julia turned slowly, eyes wide. The piano keys quivered, one of them pressing down by itself. A single note rang out, pure and fragile. Then another. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She wasn't afraid anymore. She walked toward it, step by trembling step, until she stood beside the piano. The melody continued, faint and uneven, as though played by invisible hands. And beneath it all, a whisper. Her name. Julia. She gasped. "Henry?" The music stopped. Silence filled the chapel, so thick it almost rang in her ears. Then the wind rushed through again, a sudden, sweeping gust that sent the candles toppling and the hymn books fluttering open like startled wings. One book landed near her feet, open to a page that read, "Be still and know that I am God."
Chapter 5. The Ghosts of Grace Lighthouse. The day began like a held breath, quiet, gray, and heavy with things unsaid. Julia stood by the window of her cottage, staring out at the restless sea. The letter from Henry lay open on the table beside her, its ink slightly smudged from her tears. She had read it at least a dozen times since discovering it, and still it left her heart quaking. There was no denying the handwriting, no denying the truth that somehow, impossibly, her late fiancé's words had found her here, in this lonely town, years after his death. But one question refused to fade. How did it get here? And why had Alexis, the quiet fisherman who claimed to know nothing, been praying in the abandoned chapel? She couldn't bear the uncertainty anymore. Today she would confront him. The sky was bruised with clouds as she walked down the narrow path to the docks. The smell of salt and damp wood hung thick in the air. She spotted Alexis near his small boat, repairing a torn net. His hands moved with the slow confidence of routine, but his eyes were far away. He looked up when she approached. "You're out early," he said, with a tentative smile. "Did the sea sing you awake again?" She didn't return the smile. Her voice came out firm but trembling. "We need to talk." He paused, studying her face. "What's wrong?" Julia held out the letter, her fingers shaking. "You told me you didn't know anything about the chapel's hymn, but this—" She took a sharp breath. "This was written by my fiancé, years ago, before he died. I found it inside that chapel, in a hidden place. How did it get there?" Alexis's expression flickered. Surprise, then something like pain. "Julia, I don't know what you're implying." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice breaking. "You go there at night. You pray. You knew something. Why didn't you tell me?" He set down the net and wiped his hands on his shirt, his face tightening. "Because some things are better left quiet," he said softly. "Grace Chapel isn't just an old ruin. It's where my past is buried," she interrupted, "and I'm not leaving until I know why your face goes pale every time I mention it." For a moment, only the sound of waves filled the silence between them. Then Alexis sighed heavily. "I don't think you'd understand," he murmured. "My mother used to work there, years ago. She cleaned the chapel, cared for it after the congregation fell apart. But she died, not long after the place was shut down." Julia froze. "Your mother?" He nodded slowly. "Her name was Laura." The name lingered in the air like smoke. Julia's stomach turned. She'd seen that name, scribbled in the margins of one of the old hymn books in the chapel. "She died the same year my fiancé did," she whispered. Alexis looked startled. "What are you saying?" "Maybe nothing," Julia said, her voice hollow. "Maybe everything." She turned and walked away before he could stop her. The townspeople had always spoken in hushed tones when it came to Grace Chapel. Julia had noticed it in their eyes, the way they shifted uneasily whenever she mentioned the building on the hill. But now she began to hear the whispers clearly. At the local market, while buying a loaf of bread, she overheard two women murmuring nearby. "They say Laura's spirit still walks the grounds," one said. The other replied, "It was never proven what killed her. Some say she found something she shouldn't have." Julia's blood ran cold. Later that evening, she sat on the porch of her cottage, the letter in her lap, the sound of the waves rolling endlessly beyond. Alexis's mother had died mysteriously, the same year Henry did, and somehow a letter written by Henry ended up in that very chapel where Laura worked. Coincidence? No, it felt too deliberate. "God," she whispered, "what are you trying to tell me?" But the only answer was the sea's unbroken sigh. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. The moon hung low and pale, its light pooling over the wooden floor. Something inside her stirred, a pull, soft but insistent, toward the chapel. She tried to resist it, tried to pray, but her heart thudded with restless energy, and the air in the room seemed to hum faintly, like a distant chord being struck. Finally she rose, took her coat, and stepped into the night. The path to Grace Chapel was shrouded in fog. The wind carried the scent of rain and something faintly metallic, like old stone and candle wax. Her footsteps echoed softly against the path. When she reached the chapel, the gate creaked open without her touching it. She hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The air felt colder there, the silence thick and listening. The broken piano loomed in the shadows like a sentinel. Moonlight streamed through the shattered roof, painting silver patterns across the floor. She moved down the aisle slowly, her hand brushing the tops of the pews. Each one was carved with faint initials, remnants of lives long gone. When she reached the altar, she knelt, trembling. Lord, if you're here, I need to understand. I need to know what this place has to do with Henry, and why his words found me after all these years. Her voice cracked. If you're still listening, please show me something. Her prayer dissolved into sobs. Her tears fell onto the cold stone floor. And then, a whisper, so soft she almost thought it was the wind. But no, it was too close, too familiar. Julia. Her name, spoken in Henry's voice. She froze, breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned. No one was there, only shadows. But as she stared, the single candle near the altar flickered to life. The flame burned small but steady, its light trembling like a heartbeat. Julia's chest constricted. She stumbled backward, one hand over her mouth. Henry? The air seemed to ripple. She felt warmth brush her cheek, gentle, almost like a caress. Be still. The words were barely audible, but she knew them. They were the same words from the letter, the same verse he had always quoted. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, shaking. This isn't real. You're gone. The candle flared brighter, filling the room with golden light. And then, music. The same hymn, Henry's song, drifted through the chapel once more. Soft, aching, alive. Julia pressed her hands over her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Why? She cried. Why bring me here? Why show me all this? No answer came, only the harmony of the unseen hymn wrapping around her like a whisper of heaven and sorrow entwined. When the music faded, Julia found herself staring again at the candle, its light slowly dimming. Something moved beneath the altar, a small box half hidden under fallen wood. She crawled closer, her hands trembling as she pulled it out. It was an old wooden chest, the latch rusted but still intact. She forced it open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some sealed, others open and worn by age. The first few were addressed to no one. Prayers, confessions, songs written in trembling handwriting. But one letter bore a name that made her blood run cold. To Pastor Henry Cole, care of Grace Chapel. Julia's breath caught. Henry had never mentioned corresponding with anyone in this town. Why would a letter to him be stored here? She opened it carefully. The handwriting was feminine, neat and slanted, signed Laura at the end. Pastor, I have done as you asked. The song will be kept safe in the chapel. It carries the message you spoke of, the one meant for her. You said she would come when the wind led her here. I pray I'll still be alive when she does. Julia stared at the page, her heartbeat deafening. Henry had written a message for her and trusted a stranger, Laura, to guard it. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his death. A chill rippled through her. The connection was undeniable now. Henry had known of Eden's reach. He had planned something.
And Laura, Alexis's mother, had been part of it. Julia stumbled out of the chapel, clutching the letter. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the path in pale gray. Her thoughts spun. Alexis had known all along. He must have known. Why hadn't he told her? She reached her cottage, breathless, her chest aching with rage and sorrow. The waves pounded against the rocks, mirroring her turmoil. She tore the letter from her pocket, her tears staining the page. You knew, she whispered into the storm. All this time, you knew.
She looked upward toward the dark sky. Why didn't you stop him from dying? Why make me live with this pain only to bring me here, to haunt me with ghosts and unanswered prayers? The wind howled, but no thunder followed, only the vast silence of the sea. She sank to her knees, sobbing. I believed you once, she whispered, and you took everything. Then, through the roar of the wind, the hymn began again, faint but clear. Not from the chapel this time, from within her cottage. Her head jerked up. The candle she'd left unlit on her table burned suddenly bright, and through her tears she saw a faint shadow standing near the doorway, familiar, calm, almost smiling. Be still, the voice whispered again. The candle's flame danced higher, then faded into darkness.
Chapter 6. Letters from the Past. The morning after the candle had lit itself, Julia barely moved. She sat at the edge of her bed, the letter to Pastor Henry still clutched in her hand, the ache behind her eyes pulsing like an open wound. She hadn't slept. Every creak of the cottage had sounded like footsteps, every sigh of the wind like a whispered name. When dawn finally came, she felt hollow, as though her heart had burned through the night and left only smoke. But one thought wouldn't leave her. Alexis. He had answers. Maybe not all of them, but enough. Enough to explain why Henry's words, his music, and his memory had all converged on this strange town like fate itself. And so, as the first rays of light broke across the sea, Julia pulled on her coat and walked toward the fisherman's cottage by the cliffs. Alexis was already outside, mending his fishing lines. He looked up when he saw her approaching, his face tightening with quiet guilt. "Julia," he said softly, "you shouldn't be walking alone this early." She didn't respond. Her voice, when it came, trembled with restrained anger. "You knew about the letters." He sighed, setting the net aside. "I did. Not all of it, but enough." "Then why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "Why let me wander through that chapel, terrified and confused, when you could have told me the truth?" "Because I didn't understand the truth myself," he said quietly. "Not until last night." She crossed her arms. "Then make me understand." Alexis hesitated, then motioned toward the small bench by his porch. "Sit, please." She did, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "When my mother died, she left me a small wooden box. I thought it was full of prayers she'd written. She was always writing prayers. I never opened it for years. Maybe I was afraid." He paused, drawing a slow, shaky breath. "But when I finally did, I found letters. Dozens of them, written by a preacher named Leo. They were addressed to a woman he loved deeply, though he never used her name." Julia frowned. "A preacher?" He nodded. He spoke of grace, of guilt, of losing his way and finding it again. But more than anything, he wrote about time, divine timing, he called it. That love and healing arrive not when we want them to, but when the silence has done its work. Her chest tightened. "And your mother kept them?" "Yes, she worked at the chapel during those years. She told me once that she was asked to protect a story, one that hadn't yet finished. I didn't understand what she meant until now." He reached for something beside him, a small tin box, the same one she'd seen him carrying to the chapel that night. He opened it carefully, and Julia saw the neatly folded letters inside, yellowed by age and bound with a faded ribbon. "I want you to have them," he said, his voice low. "You're the woman he wrote to." Julia stared at him, stunned. "That's not possible." "I didn't think so either," Alexis said, handing her the box.
But after what's happened, the letter you found, the song, the candle, I don't think any of this is coincidence." She hesitated, then reached for the box. Her hands trembled as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the kind of script formed by someone who had written many sermons but rarely love letters. "To the one who still believes she's forgotten. If grace had a sound, it would be your voice. I have spent months trying to make peace with silence, but I've learned that silence only hurts when we fill it with fear instead of faith." Julia's vision blurred as she continued reading. "When I preach, I tell others that faith is trusting even when God seems quiet. But in truth, I am the one still learning that lesson. I told you once that love is God's reflection, that if He calls me to silence, it is not punishment, but preparation." She pressed the letter to her chest, her throat tight. It sounded like Henry, the way he used to speak when he wasn't performing, when he was simply himself. Her fingers moved to the next letter. The ink on this one had bled in places, as though written with tears. "To the one who ran from grace. You once said that silence feels like abandonment, but I have found that it is the pause between verses, where the song breathes. If you ever return to the place of quiet waters, you will find what I left for you." Julia froze. The place of quiet waters. She looked up at Alexis. He nodded slowly. "I thought the same." Her eyes fell back to the box. She pulled out another letter, this one shorter, almost unfinished. "If you find these words, it means you survived what I did not. Do not look for me in the songs that ended, but in the silence that begins again." Her tears spilled freely now. "It's him," she whispered. "These were Henry's words. Maybe he used another name, but I know his heart in every line." Alexis said nothing. He only watched her with quiet reverence, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. As the hours passed, Julia read each letter carefully, her heart unraveling with every word. They spoke of doubt and devotion, of a man who loved a woman, but feared that love would distract him from his calling. They spoke of a song, the hymn that haunted the chapel, that was meant to carry a message about faith surviving loss. One letter read, "If ever my voice fails, promise me that you will not stop singing. The song was never mine. It was for you." She closed her eyes, a sob breaking from her chest. All this time she had believed that her voice dying in that accident was a punishment, that God had silenced her because she failed to protect Henry. But what if it wasn't punishment? What if it was a pause, a divine silence preparing her to hear again, not to perform, but to understand? For the first time in years, something warm flickered beneath her sorrow. It wasn't joy, not yet, but peace trying to find a place to rest. When she reached the bottom of the box, she found an empty envelope. It was neatly labeled in the same handwriting, but the paper inside was gone. Across the front, written in bold strokes, were the words, "When the silence speaks." Her pulse quickened. "There's one missing," she whispered. Alexis leaned forward. "What do you mean?" She turned the empty envelope toward him. "It should have been here. The others were in order, each letter numbered, but this one was meant to be the last." He frowned. "My mother must not have had it." "Or someone took it," Julia said softly. "Maybe that's what she found before she died." They stared at each other, the weight of unspoken fear hanging in the air. "Do you think," Alexis began hesitantly, "that the missing letter could still be in the chapel?" Julia nodded slowly. "If these letters were meant to lead me here, then the final one must be waiting for me to find it. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low, heavy, like a drumbeat beneath their words. Before she left, Julia placed her hand gently over the letters and said, "Thank you." She wasn't sure if she was speaking to God, to Henry, or to both. The candle flickered, and the wind outside softened, as if the sea itself exhaled in peace. But just as she stood to leave, a soft tapping echoed against the window. She turned. A folded piece of paper lay caught in the corner of the frame, damp from rain. It must have been blown there, though how it had found its way to her window in the middle of the storm, she couldn't imagine. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding. The handwriting was the same careful slant, the same ink faded by time. Across the top was written, "When the silence speaks." Her vision blurred as she read the lines below. "By the time you find this, I will be gone. But don't let grief steal your song. The silence you fear is not the absence of sound. It's the space where faith grows wings. When you hear nothing, listen deeper. That's where I'll be." Her hands trembled. "Henry," she whispered. The candle beside her flared, bright and steady, its flame unmoved by the wind that pressed against the window. The room filled with warmth, not frightening, but holy. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone.
Chapter 7. The Storm. The wind came first, low, restless, and uneasy. By evening, it had gathered its voice, howling across the sea like something alive. The waves churned with fury, battering the rocks below the cliffs. From her cottage window, Julia watched as rain swept sideways, drumming against the glass. She had seen storms before, but never one like this. It felt personal, as if the sea itself had been waiting for her, holding back years of grief and fury, only to release it now, on the night she had finally begun to understand. The letters lay on the table, carefully arranged in the small wooden box. She had dried the one marked "When the Silence Speaks," pressing it between pages of her old notebook. Even now, the single line that had survived still echoed in her mind. "You will find me where grace whispers." She didn't know what it meant yet, but something deep inside her whispered back, "You will." A sudden crash made her jump. Outside, lightning split the sky, a jagged scar of light across the blackness. The thunder that followed shook the walls. She blew out her candle, afraid the wind might shatter the window and scatter the flames. But even in darkness, the voice inside her was clear. "Go to the chapel." She shook her head. "No, not now. It's dangerous." But the whisper only grew louder, not in her ears, in her spirit. A call like the song she once heard drifting across the water. She pulled her coat tight around her shoulders, grabbed a lantern, and stepped into the storm. The path to the chapel was nearly gone, washed away by rushing water. Each step was a battle against the wind that clawed at her, shoving her sideways. Rain stung her face, soaking her hair and clothes, but she pressed on. The ocean roared to her left, wild and merciless. Its waves struck the cliffs in bursts that sounded like thunder made flesh. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the chapel ahead, half hidden in sheets of rain. Its wooden doors banged open and shut in the wind, moaning like an old wounded creature. The roof looked torn, jagged pieces of timber jutting upward like broken ribs. Julia ran toward it, boots splashing through rising water. She stumbled once, scraping her palm against a rock, but didn't stop. By the time she reached the chapel steps, her lantern flame was nearly out. She shielded it with her hand, whispering, "Please, just a little longer." The light flickered, then steadied, soft, golden, almost defiant. She stepped inside. Water streamed through the broken roof, running in rivulets down the walls. The pews were half submerged, floating slightly in the rising flood that crept up from the sea. Candles that had once lined the altar were toppled or drowned, their wicks dark and lifeless. The air smelled of salt and damp wood, and something else. Smoke. She froze. For a moment she thought she saw a faint shimmer near the altar, like someone had just been there holding a lantern. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her eyes fell on the box of letters. It sat atop the small wooden table near the front, right where she had left it that afternoon after returning it to the chapel for safekeeping. The water had already reached its legs. "No," she breathed. She splashed forward, heart pounding, and grabbed the box just as the table gave way. The wood cracked beneath the pressure, and the box slipped from her hands into the water. "Please," she cried, plunging after it. Her fingers brushed the edge, but the current dragged it toward the altar. She waded forward, fighting the surge. A wave of icy water crashed through the broken windows, knocking her off balance. She caught herself against a pew and forced herself onward. The box bobbed against the altar steps. She lunged, clutching it to her chest. "Got you," she gasped. Another flash of lightning filled the chapel, and that's when she saw it. The altar's wooden cross had split open where the storm had torn through the roof. Inside, something glimmered faintly in the flickering light. A small compartment, a hollow space, and within it, something wrapped in oilcloth. Julia hesitated. "No," she whispered, "it can't be." But her spirit already knew. Clutching the soaked box to her side, she reached toward the cross and pried at the wood. It gave with a soft creak, revealing the hidden bundle. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free. Inside the cloth was a sealed envelope. The ink on the front had blurred, but she could still make out the words written in careful script. For the one who kept believing, when the silence speaks. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the missing letter. The roof groaned overhead, a deep splintering sound. She looked up, too late. A beam cracked, falling with a deafening crash. Julia dove aside, clutching the letter to her chest. Splintered wood splintered, water surged, and the lantern was thrown from her hand, its flame extinguished in the flood. Darkness swallowed the chapel. "God," she gasped, coughing, "please, not like this." But instead of panic, she felt something strange, a calm, deep and steady beneath the chaos. She could almost hear a voice, soft and familiar, woven into the sound of the rain. "You are not alone." Julia pressed the letter to her heart. "If this is where faith leads, then I'll follow." She waded through the rising water toward the door, pushing against the current. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her will held steady. Another crash, and the doors burst open, the wind howling through the chapel like a living thing. The surge of water nearly threw her off her feet, but she gripped the doorframe and pulled herself through, stumbling into the storm outside. The wind tore at her coat as she ran down the hill, the rain stinging her skin like tiny needles. The sea had swallowed part of the path, turning it into a river. Her cottage light was a faint golden glow in the distance, her only guide. She slipped once, tumbling to her knees. The box flew from her grasp, but she scrambled after it, clutching it tight again. "Not the letters," she whispered. "Not after everything." By the time she reached her door, she was soaked, shaking, and breathless. She shut it behind her and sank to the floor, the box and the letter still in her hands. The storm raged on outside, pounding against the walls, but inside, the cottage was quiet, almost reverent. Julia laid the box gently on the table, then unwrapped the letter. The paper was water-stained and fragile, the seal softened by time and rain. Her fingers shook as she pried it open. The ink had run, words bleeding into each other like tears on a page. Most of it was unreadable, except for one line that had been written with such force that it had cut deeper into the paper, surviving the storm. "You will find me where grace whispers." She traced the words with trembling fingers. A sob broke from her, not of sorrow, but something deeper. Relief, wonder, understanding. She didn't need to find Henry anymore. He had already found her not in form, but in faith, not in voice, but in silence. And Grace had been whispering all along. For the first time in years, she knelt, not to beg, not to bargain, but to surrender. "Lord," she whispered, eyes closed, tears mingling with rainwater on her cheeks, "I've asked for healing when what I needed was purpose. I thought my silence was punishment, but it was you, waiting for me to listen. If grace still speaks, let it speak through me." The wind outside softened, the roar of the sea easing into a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. In that stillness, she felt it, not a voice, but a presence, a warmth that filled the room, wrapping around her like an unseen embrace. For a long time she stayed there, kneeling by the flickering candlelight, her hands resting on the letter. When she finally rose, the storm had begun to fade. She walked to the window. The sky was still dark, but a faint silver shimmer touched the horizon. The sea, once violent and wild, was calming, waves now gentle and steady against the shore. She whispered the line once more, "You will find me where grace whispers." And this time, she understood. Grace wasn't found in thunder or revelation, but in the quiet courage to keep believing, even when the storm had taken everything. By morning, the world looked washed clean. The air smelled of salt and earth, and sunlight spilled across the wet sand like gold. The chapel stood broken but still upright, its cross glinting faintly in the distance. Julia walked down to the shore, the box of letters tucked under her arm. The sea lapped at her feet, calm, forgiving. She knelt and whispered, "Thank you for the storm." For it had not destroyed her, it had delivered her. The wind brushed against her face, gentle this time, carrying a sound that could have been the sea or the sky or something beyond both, a soft hum, a note of a song she once knew. She smiled through her tears. Grace was whispering again.
Chapter 8, Where Grace Whispers. The world was still damp from the storm. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. Julia walked along the edge of the cliffs, her boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The wind had changed, gentler now, almost like a sigh after weeping. The sea below sparkled beneath the early light, its surface broken only by the slow pulse of waves breathing against the rocks. In her coat pocket, she carried the last letter. The edges were tattered, the ink faded, but the words that had survived glowed in her memory. "You will find me where grace whispers." She didn't know exactly what that meant, not yet, but she felt drawn here, to this place where the ocean spoke in a language older than words. Locals had called it the Whispering Point. It was said that when the wind passed through the rocks in a certain way, it made music, soft, unearthly tones that rose and fell like distant singing. As she reached the crest, Julia paused to catch her breath. Her heart thudded, but it wasn't only from the climb. The place seemed charged, like the air itself was alive, waiting for her to listen. She closed her eyes. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint hum. It came not from the sea or the sky, but somewhere near her feet, a subtle vibration beneath the stone. She knelt, brushing aside wet grass and sand. Something metallic caught the morning light. A small cross, weathered, its base buried in earth and seaweed. Julia's breath caught. Carefully, she lifted it, and there, half buried beneath it, was a rusted tin box. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. The box creaked open with effort, and inside lay a small black audio recorder. It looked decades old, its buttons worn smooth, but the label on its side was clear enough to read. Grace Chapel Recording, Leo. Leo. Her heart stuttered. That was her fiancé's name,
before she'd called him Henry, before his ministry grew, before everything changed. Few people had known him as Leo, only her. The sea breeze lifted her hair as if urging her on. Slowly, she pressed the play button. Static filled the air at first, rough, grainy, alive with age. Then came a sound that froze her where she knelt. A man's breath, a soft chuckle, and then music. Be still, my soul, though storms may rage. Grace whispers loudest in the pain. Julia's hand flew to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision. It was him, his voice, raw, unpolished, achingly familiar. The hymn that had haunted her dreams, the melody that had filled the chapel that night, the song that she thought came from some ghostly place. It was right here, recorded in this tiny box. Her mind reeled, grasping at questions that tumbled over one another. When had he done this? Why had it been hidden here? And then the words shifted. The singing faded into his voice speaking, softly, directly into the recorder. Julia, if you ever hear this, then somehow grace found a way to reach you. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but if I've learned anything, it's that silence doesn't mean God is gone. It means He's working where words can't. If you ever lose your song, promise me, you'll listen for His. Her tears fell freely now. She clutched the recorder to her chest, rocking slightly, as if trying to hold on to a voice that could slip away again, at any moment. He'd known. Somehow he'd known. But before she could press play again, the recording sputtered, a crackle, a high-pitched whine, and then went silent. "Please, no," she whispered, tapping it, shaking it gently. The old device gave one last wheeze of static, and then, faintly, beneath the distortion, came a whisper. Not from Leo this time, something softer, closer. "Sing again, Julia." Her heart stopped. She looked up sharply. Alexis stood a few feet behind her, raincoat damp, hair wind-tossed, his expression torn between awe and sorrow. He had tears in his eyes. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I followed you when I saw you heading toward the cliffs. I was worried." Julia stared, still holding the recorder. You heard it?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, his voice. I recognized it the moment you pressed play." She knitted her brows. "How could you recognize it?" He hesitated, stepping closer. The wind whipped his coat around his legs. "Because I've heard it before. When I was a boy, my mother used to sing that same hymn. She said she learned it from a preacher who stayed in the town years ago, a man who told her that one day the song would find its way home." Julia's breath trembled. "Your mother, she was the caretaker of the chapel." He nodded. "The one who found him after the accident." His voice broke. "He didn't die right away. She said he was barely conscious, but he kept whispering your name and asked her to record the song for him. She promised she would hide it somewhere it could wait until grace whispered to the one it was meant for." The sea roared below, waves crashing against the rocks. As Julia tried to steady herself, You knew all this time?" "No." His eyes glistened. "Not until I saw your face the day you came. The way you looked at the chapel, the way you trembled when you heard the hymn. I knew there was something sacred in your pain. My mother told me once that grace has a strange way of repeating itself. I just didn't realize it was repeating for you." Julia's fingers tightened around the recorder. "So all these years, the song wasn't haunting me." He shook his head gently. "It was calling you." The two of them stood in silence, the wind curling around them like a whisper of something unseen. The sea shimmered below, sunlight breaking through the clouds in shafts that lit the water like glass. Julia turned back toward the horizon, her heart both heavy and light. "I used to believe God had taken everything from me," she said softly. "My voice, my love, my purpose. But maybe he was only quiet because he was waiting for this moment." Alexis stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Grace waits for us longer than we ever wait for it." The recorder crackled again in her hand, a faint hum, as if the wind itself was pressing play. Leo's voice returned, distorted but unmistakable. "If grace finds you, don't keep it to yourself. Let others hear what silence taught you." Julia smiled through her tears. He always knew how to make faith sound like poetry. She looked at Alexis. "Do you hear it?" He nodded. "The wind?" "No," she said. "The music." The sea seemed to rise in rhythm, a soft melody woven through the sound of air rushing between the cliffs. The same notes she'd once thought belonged to ghosts now felt alive, divine. She took a step closer to the edge, where the wind was strongest. The recorder hummed softly in her hand, the final trace of Leo's song looping faintly. Without thinking, she began to hum along. Her voice, fragile, rusty, uncertain, trembled on the first note. It cracked, faltered, then found a thread of tone. The sound startled her, raw and unpolished, but real. She tried again. The melody grew stronger, carried by the wind until it seemed to blend with the sea. Alexis watched in silent reverence, tears slipping down his cheeks. For the first time in years, Julia sang, not for applause, not for fame, but for healing. And in that moment, grace whispered back. When her song faded into the breeze, Julia turned toward Alexis. Her throat burned from the effort, but her eyes glowed with peace. "I thought I'd lost my voice forever." He smiled softly. "Maybe you just needed to find where it belonged." They sat together on the grass, the recorder between them. The waves crashed below like applause from creation itself. "Do you ever think," Julia said quietly, "that the things we lose aren't taken, they're just transformed? That love doesn't vanish, it just changes shape?" Alexis nodded. "My mother used to say that grace is like the tide. It always returns, even if it goes out for a while." Julia smiled. "Then maybe that's what faith is, waiting by the shore." The sun dipped lower, painting the sea in hues of amber and rose.
A seabird called out overhead, and for a moment everything was still, utterly still, except for the whisper of wind curling through the cliffs. It carried one final echo of Leo's song, faint but unmistakable. "Be still, my soul, though storms may rage. Grace whispers loudest in the pain." Julia closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. The pain didn't disappear, the grief didn't vanish, but they no longer ruled her. They had become part of the hymn, notes of her own redemption. Days passed, and the town slowly began to heal with her. The storm had left its scars, broken rooftops, flooded paths, but something deeper had shifted. Julia visited the chapel often, cleaning what the sea had taken. The roof still needed repair, but sunlight streamed through the gaps now, falling onto the altar where the wooden cross still stood. She placed the recorder there one morning and pressed play. Leo's song filled the space, imperfect but alive, weaving through the quiet like a prayer made of sound. A few townspeople stopped at the doorway, drawn by the music. An old woman, a child, a man with a limp, all stood silently, eyes wide, listening. No one spoke, no one needed to. When the recording ended, Julia whispered, "He left his song for us. Now it's our turn." And for the first time since the scandal that closed it, Grace Chapel lived up to its name again. That evening, Julia returned to the cliffs. The wind had softened, carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. She stood where she had found the recorder and looked out over the endless horizon. The sun sank low, turning the sea to molten gold. She whispered into the wind, "I found you." And somewhere, in the rustle of grass, in the hum of air between stones, in the rhythm of her own heartbeat, she felt an answer, "You never lost me." Her lips curved into a trembling smile. Then she began to sing again, softly, freely, her voice carried by the same wind that had once frightened her. The cliffs caught her melody, echoing it back in gentle tones, as if the sea itself had learned the song. Below, the waves danced. Above, the light lingered, and between them, where heaven touched earth, grace whispered still.
Chapter 9. The Voice Returns. Morning came with the scent of rain and rebirth. The storm that had nearly drowned Eden's Reach had passed, leaving the town washed in silver light. The sea still whispered against the rocks, soft and rhythmic, like the slow breathing of something ancient and kind. The townsfolk were already gathered near Grace Chapel, their voices weaving together like threads of hope. For the first time in years, laughter mingled with the sound of hammering and sweeping, as if heaven itself had breathed the second wind into the place. Julia stood a little apart, watching from the rise of the hill. The chapel roof, patched hurriedly after the storm, gleamed with fresh wood. Her fingers brushed over the soaked letters she had managed to save. Letters from Leo, her lost love, whose words had led her here. Each one now lay drying inside a box on a bedside table, faint ink holding fast against the water, as if even the sea couldn't erase what Grace had written. A breeze tugged at her scarf, and for a fleeting moment she could almost hear that voice again, the voice that once sang beside hers, laughing, praying, believing. "You will find me where grace whispers," it had said, and she had. Now standing before the chapel's open doors, Julia felt the quiet trembling of purpose. Yet fear still lived inside her like a shadow that refused to die. She hadn't sung in front of anyone since the night of the accident. Her voice, her greatest gift, her deepest wound, had betrayed her too many times. The idea of singing again, here, before these people who had unknowingly helped her heal, felt both sacred and impossible. "Julia!" She turned to see Alexis approaching, a soft smile on his wind-tanned face. The fisherman had become her friend. No, more than that. He had been her anchor in this strange harbor of grace. "They're ready to start. Pastor Graham asked if you'd lead the hymn." Her heart stumbled. "Lead it?" He nodded. "It's the one from the recorder, the hymn Leo wrote." Julia looked toward the chapel again. Through the open windows, she could see the townsfolk taking their seats, carpenters, bakers, children with ribbons in their hair, widows in black shawls, ordinary people with extraordinary hope. "I can't," she whispered. "My voice, it isn't what it was." Alexis's gaze was gentle but firm. "Maybe it's not supposed to be. Maybe what they need isn't the old Julia Lucas. Maybe they just need the one who's still here." The words sank deep inside her, unsettling something that had been dormant in her for too long. Inside, Grace Chapel was alive again. Sunlight streamed through the restored stained glass windows, casting patches of color across the pews. Where once there had been decay and dust, now there was the sound of sweeping brooms, laughter, and prayer. Julia found a seat near the front, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched as the small choir gathered, their voices uncertain at first, rising in hesitant harmony. The melody was familiar, his melody. The hymn Leo had written was simple yet profound, a song about waiting in silence, about faith found not in noise or applause, but in stillness. The lyrics echoed through her like an old memory she had tried too hard to bury. When the sea is still and the sky stands near, grace will whisper what your heart can't hear. Be still, beloved, though the dark may fall. The silence is not empty. It is God's call. Her breath caught. Every word felt like a thread stitching her broken soul back together. Then from somewhere in the back,
A voice called out, "Sing with us, Julia." She turned. It was a young girl, the same one who had brought her seashells weeks ago, saying they sounded like songs trapped in the sea. The congregation began to murmur in encouragement. "Please, Miss Julia." She shook her head, panic tightening her chest. "I can't. My voice." But then Alexis rose and walked toward her, offering his hand. His eyes held no pressure, only faith. "Then don't sing for them. Sing with them. Sing for the one who never stopped believing in you." Something broke inside her, something proud, something fearful, and what replaced it was surrender. She stood, the room quieted, anticipation thick as the sea air. The old piano's keys gleamed under a beam of light, repaired just enough to hold a tune. Julia took a slow step forward, then another. The congregation watched, silent, reverent. She laid a trembling hand on the piano's worn surface. "Lord," she whispered under her breath, "I have no song left unless you sing through me." Then she opened her mouth. At first, only air came out, a breath, a sigh, a ghost of a melody. Her throat tightened, but Alexis began to hum behind her, soft and steady. The choir joined in, then the congregation, and slowly, gently, Julia's voice returned. It wasn't the polished, flawless voice of her former fame. It was roughed in places, trembling, raw with emotion, but it was alive. It carried the ache of loss and the tremor of faith, the strength of survival and the sweetness of surrender. The sound filled the chapel, filling cracks in the walls and hearts alike. It rose to the rafters like a bird taking flight for the first time in years. As she sang, tears streamed down her face. Each note felt like letting go. Each breath felt like grace itself. When the hymn ended, silence fell, a holy kind of silence. And then, as she lifted her eyes, she saw it. A light, soft but steady, glowed through the repaired stained glass window above the altar. The morning sun had broken through the clouds, and its beam fell directly on a section of the wall newly revealed by the storm's damage. There, in faint gold letters beneath layers of plaster that had peeled away, were the words, "Your silence was never empty." Julia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She could barely stand. The message shimmered in the light, undeniable, sacred. The congregation turned to see it too, murmuring in awe. "What does it mean?" a child whispered. Julia's voice shook as she answered, "It means he was never gone. Even in the silence, he was speaking." She stepped closer to the words, running her fingers over the faded paint. A sense of peace, pure, encompassing, washed through her. All the years of pain, the questions, the anger, the guilt, it all felt seen, answered, redeemed. Alexis joined her at the altar, his eyes wet. "You found your song," he said softly. She nodded. "No," she whispered, smiling through tears. "Grace found me." That night, the town gathered by the sea for a small celebration. Lanterns swayed in the breeze, their reflections dancing on the waves. Children ran barefoot in the sand, their laughter blending with the sound of surf. Julia stood beside Alexis, looking out at the water. The sea no longer frightened her. It no longer sounded like loss. It sang. "Do you ever think he knew," asked Alexis quietly, "Leo, that you'd come here someday?" She smiled faintly. "He believed in divine timing. Maybe this was it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the horizon brush with starlight. Then Julia began to hum again, the hymn, but softer this time, almost a whisper. The breeze caught her voice, carrying it far over the water to where the cliffs met the sky. Somewhere deep in her spirit, she felt it again, the same whisper that had guided her through the darkness. "Sing again, Julia." And she did. The waves answered in rhythm, the stars listened in stillness, and for the first time since the accident, Julia Lucas wasn't the broken singer or the grieving lover.
She was simply a voice redeemed, proof that silence was never the end, only the space where grace begins to speak.
Chapter 10. The Song Beyond the Silence. The days grew slower in Eden's reach, the kind of slow that wasn't empty but sacred, like the hush between heartbeats. The storm season had long passed, leaving behind skies that seemed endlessly blue, and a sea that shimmered as if heaven itself had fallen into it. The chapel stood proud again on the hill, its fresh white walls and bright stained glass catching every sunrise. Julia walked the narrow path toward it that morning, her bare feet brushing against wildflowers that had begun to bloom where the storm had once left ruin. In her arms, she carried a stack of worn music sheets and a small box of chalks. The chapel bell, newly restored, gave a single soft ring as she approached, a sound that had once haunted her, now comforting her like an old hymn. It had been 6 months since that morning she sang again, the day her voice returned and her silence was redeemed. 6 months since she chose to stay in Eden's reach, not as a stranger running from her past, but as someone reborn into purpose. Now the chapel wasn't just a place of worship. It had become a sanctuary for healing. Inside, rows of benches had been replaced by open space and instruments donated by locals. A few guitars, an old drum, and a keyboard Alexis had repaired himself. On the back wall, carved in smooth wood, were the words that had changed everything. Your silence was never empty. Julia smiled at them as she opened the doors wide. Light flooded in, dust motes spinning in the golden air. Children's laughter echoed outside, her students arriving, their voices bright with energy and innocence. She loved that sound. They came from different corners of life. Children who had lost parents, teens who stopped believing in themselves, even a few adults who carried invisible wounds. Every week they gathered to learn music, not for perfection, but for peace. "All right, everyone," Julia said, clapping her hands. "Today we're not learning new notes, we're learning how to listen." The students exchanged puzzled looks. "Music isn't just what you play," she continued, her tone gentle. "It's what you hear when you stop trying to control the sound. Sometimes grace whispers in the quiet between the notes." She knelt beside a young boy named Caleb, who always sat apart. His mother had passed away during the last winter, and though he never said much, Julia saw the same silence in him that had once lived in her. "Here," she said softly, handing him a small tambourine. "Close your eyes. Don't play yet. Just breathe." He obeyed. The other children followed suit, the chapel falling into a still, reverent hush. "Now," she whispered, "listen." Outside, the wind brushed against the seagrass. Waves rolled against the shore, steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere a bird sang. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Caleb nodded, eyes still closed. "It sounds like singing." Julia smiled. "That's what healing sounds like." Later that afternoon, Alexis arrived carrying a plank of wood under one arm and a toolbox in the other. His hands were calloused, his shirt speckled with paint and dust. "Rebuilding again?" Julia teased, wiping her hands on her skirt. He grinned. "Always. The back wall's starting to lean a bit. Thought I'd fix it before it falls on your students mid-song. They'd think it was percussion practice." He laughed, a deep, honest sound that filled the room. Together they worked side by side, the rhythm of their movements, the soft scrape of sandpaper, the creak of the hammer, blended with the murmurs of the sea outside. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. They didn't have to. The silence between them had become its own language, one that said, "I'm grateful you're here." When they finally paused for rest, Julia brought out 2 mugs of tea and sat with him on the chapel steps. "You've rebuilt this place more times than I can count," she said. "Don't you ever get tired of fixing things?" Alexis looked toward the horizon where the water met the light.
Not if it's something worth saving. She followed his gaze, her eyes softening. You mean the chapel? He shook his head. I mean you. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the deep stillness of truth. She looked down, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. I was broken beyond repair, she whispered. Alexa smiled faintly. And yet, here you are, teaching others how to sing again. She didn't answer, but her eyes glistened with something that wasn't quite sadness anymore. That evening, after the students left and the chapel quieted, Julia lingered by the altar. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and ocean salt. On the table lay the box of letters, Leo's letters, now kept not as relics of sorrow, but as symbols of divine timing. She opened the box gently, pulling out one of the envelopes. The ink had faded even more, but the words still breathed. If love is true, it never dies. It simply changes its song until we learn to hear it again. A single tear slid down her cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for leading me here, for teaching me that silence can sing. She replaced the letter, then took up a small wooden plaque Alexis had carved earlier that week. The engraving read, Grace Chapel, reborn in memory of Laura and Pastor Leo. Together, she and Alexis mounted it beside the door. The setting sun painted the words in gold. That night, long after the lamps in the town had dimmed, Julia walked to the shore. The moon hung low, silver and soft, and the tide whispered secrets against the sand. The air was cool, the stars close enough to touch. She carried her old guitar, the same one she hadn't touched since before the accident. Its wood was cracked in places, its strings worn, but it still held the memory of her first songs. She sat on a rock near the edge of the water and began to play. Slow, tentative at first, then steady and sure. The melody was one she had once sung with Leo, the hymn that had carried her through every chapter of loss and redemption. When the sea is still and the sky stands near, grace will whisper what your heart can't hear. Her voice floated into the night, blending with the sound of waves. It was no longer the flawless voice of fame. It was real, weathered by pain, made beautiful by honesty. As she reached the final verse, a soft wind stirred. It moved through her hair, around her shoulders, and across the water. And in that moment, she heard it. A second voice. It was faint, almost lost in the breeze, but unmistakable. A harmony, warm, familiar, tender. It wrapped around her melody like light meeting shadow. She froze, heart pounding. Her eyes lifted toward the open sea, where moonlight rippled like liquid glass. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw him, not in form, but in presence. The peace that filled her wasn't fear, but understanding. She smiled through tears, whispering, I hear you too. Her voice broke softly on the last word, carried away by the wind. The waves answered in rhythm. The stars shimmered brighter, as if leaning in to listen. And then, in the quiet that followed, there was no pain, no longing, only gratitude. The hymn ended, but its echo lingered, weaving itself into the breath of the sea, into the heart of the town, and into every soul that would someday walk through the doors of Grace Chapel. The next morning, Eden's Reach awoke to calm waters and a sunrise that set the world aglow. Julia stood outside the chapel as her students arrived, each one holding an instrument, ready to make music again. "Good morning, Miss Julia," they called, their laughter filling the air. She smiled, looking toward the horizon where light met water. "Good morning," she whispered back, although part of her knew the words weren't just for them. Somewhere beyond the waves, Grace whispered in return, and this time she didn't need to sing to hear it.
Thank you for listening. If you like this audio recording, kindly share, Like the video and subscribe for more inspiring faith-based stories and Christian romance audiobooks.